What if I told you the Great Depression wasn't just about soup lines and stock market crashes? That behind the black and white photographs of dust storms and breadlines, there's a version of American history so unsettling. Most textbooks simply skip it. Sterilization programs targeting the poor, vigilante violence against desperate families, government officials who watched children starve while warehouses sat full of food. You probably think you know this era. Hoovervilles, the New Deal, FDR's fireside chats. That's the sanitized version, the one that fits neatly into a classroom slideshow. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The 1930s in America were darker, stranger, and far more brutal than most people realize. These aren't rumors or exaggerations. They're documented events, buried in newspaper archives, court records, and government reports that most people never bother to read. So before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. YouTube's algorithm doesn't exactly reward dark history, so I need your help getting these stories in front of more people who deserve to hear them. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and settle in, because we're about to walk through 99 facts about the Great Depression that never made it into your history class. Some will make you angry, some will make you uncomfortable. A few might genuinely disturb you. We're talking about desperate choices, quiet cruelties, and moments when the American dream cracked wide open for an entire generation. This isn't about blaming one party, one president, or one group of people. It's about understanding what really happened when the economy collapsed and the social contract nearly broke with it. Let's go back to the early 1930s when banks were failing, families were starving, and America was about to reveal just how far it would go to survive. Number 1, the 1929 stock market crash. Everyone knows the date, October 1929, but here's what they don't teach you. The crash itself didn't cause the Great Depression. It was more like the first crack in a dam that had been weakening for years. Stock prices had been inflated by speculation, people buying on margin, borrowing money they didn't have to buy stocks they couldn't afford. When the market turned, it didn't just dip, it collapsed, and it kept collapsing for years. Billions of dollars in paper wealth vanished almost overnight. But the real damage wasn't the initial crash. It was the slow-motion economic disaster that followed. Businesses closing, credit drying up, and an entire financial system that had been built on confidence suddenly discovering it had none left. The crash was the headline. The years of suffering that followed were the real story. And that story is where things get genuinely dark. Number 2, Black Tuesday. October 29th, 1929 earned its own nickname, because that's the day panic truly set in. Investors traded roughly 16 million shares in a single day, a number so unprecedented the ticker tape couldn't even keep up in real time. People were selling anything and everything, desperate to get out before prices fell further. Fortunes were wiped out in hours. Men who'd been millionaires that morning were broke by dinner time. Wall Street brokers reportedly working late into the night just trying to process the sheer volume of frantic transactions. Stories circulated of ruined investors jumping from buildings, though historians now believe suicide rates during this period have been somewhat exaggerated in popular memory. Still, the psychological shock was real. Confidence in the American financial system didn't just crack that day, it shattered, and that shattered confidence would take over a decade to rebuild. Number 3, bank failures. Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. More than 9,000 American banks failed between 1930 and 1933. That's not a typo. 9,000. Each failure meant real families losing real money, often their entire life savings, gone in an instant. Small town banks, big city banks, it didn't matter. The banking system was built on trust, and once that trust evaporated, banks started failing like dominoes. When a bank failed, there was no safety net. Your money simply disappeared into whatever debts and bad investments had sunk the institution. Farmers lost the money meant for next year's seeds. Widows lost pensions. Small business owners lost their entire operating capital. Multiply that individual devastation by 9,000 separate collapses, and you start to understand why so many Americans developed a lifelong distrust of banks that lasted well into the following decades. Number 4, no federal deposit insurance. This is the detail that makes bank failures even more devastating once you understand it. Before 1933, there was no federal program ensuring your bank deposits. None. If your bank failed, your money was simply gone. There was no government safety net waiting to make you whole again. Imagine working your entire life, carefully saving every extra dollar, only to have it vanish because the bank made bad investments you had no knowledge of and no control over. This happened to millions of Americans. Entire families who had done everything right, saved responsibly, avoided debt, still ended up with absolutely nothing because the institution holding their money collapsed. It's difficult to overstate how this single missing protection amplified the human suffering of the era. The eventual creation of federal deposit insurance would fundamentally change American banking, but for millions during the Depression, that protection came far too late. Number 5. Bank runs. Once people realized banks could fail without warning, panic became its own destructive force. A rumor, sometimes true, sometimes completely false, that a bank might be insolvent, could send crowds rushing to withdraw their cash immediately. Lines would form around city blocks, people desperate to pull their money out before it disappeared. Here's the cruel irony. These bank runs could actually cause failures at banks that were otherwise perfectly stable. No bank keeps all its depositors' money sitting in a vault. It's loaned out, invested, put to work, when everyone demands their cash simultaneously. Even a healthy bank simply cannot produce that much physical currency fast enough. So a rumor alone could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, transforming a stable institution into a failed one within days. Fear itself became a genuine economic weapon during this period, and nobody had figured out how to stop it from spreading. Number 6. The 1933 banking holiday. By the time Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the banking system was in complete freefall. His response was dramatic. He ordered nearly every bank in the entire country closed immediately for 4 straight days. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a mandatory shutdown of America's entire financial infrastructure. The goal was simple: stop the panic dead in its tracks before it destroyed what remained of the banking system. During those 4 days, government examiners scrambled to inspect banks, determining which were fundamentally sound and which needed to stay closed permanently. When banks began reopening, Roosevelt addressed the nation directly through radio, reassuring Americans that their money would actually be safe now. It worked remarkably well. People started redepositing cash they'd been hiding under mattresses. It was an extraordinary, almost unthinkable use of federal power, shutting down the entire banking system. But it may have prevented an even deeper collapse than the one already underway. Number 7. The unemployment peak. By 1933, unemployment in the United States reached roughly 1/4 of the entire labor force. Historians estimate around 25%, which means 1 in every 4 workers who wanted a job simply could not find one. Think about what that actually means for a country. It's not just an economic statistic. It's millions of households with no income, no way to pay rent, no way to buy food. Entire communities were affected simultaneously, so there was no wealthy neighboring town to lean on for support. Everyone was struggling at once. Industrial centers were hit especially hard as factories shut down or slashed their workforce to a fraction of what it had been. The psychological toll matched the financial one. Men who had defined themselves through their work suddenly had no work to define themselves by. Suicide rates, mental health crises, and family breakdowns all rose alongside the unemployment numbers. And here's the unsettling part: that 25% figure might actually understate how bad things really were. Number 8. Invisible unemployment. Official unemployment statistics from the era have a significant blind spot. They often fail to count discouraged workers who had simply given up looking for jobs entirely, believing correctly in many cases that no work was available. They also miss people doing unpaid labor on family farms or in family businesses, technically employed but earning nothing. And they overlooked Americans surviving through irregular, informal work, odd jobs, bartering, seasonal labor that didn't fit neatly into any official category. This means the real suffering was likely worse than the headline numbers suggested. Economists and historians who've dug into the data since believe true underemployment and hidden joblessness push the real figures considerably higher than the official 1 in 4. This invisible unemployment rarely gets mentioned in basic history lessons, But it matters because it represents millions of Americans who fell through the cracks of official record keeping while still experiencing every bit of the economic devastation. They simply weren't being counted, which meant government relief programs designed around official statistics may have underestimated exactly how many people desperately needed help. Number 9. Wage cuts. Having a job during the Great Depression didn't necessarily mean you were safe. Millions of workers who managed to keep their positions still faced brutal reductions in pay. Employers, squeezed by falling demand and shrinking revenue, often cut wages dramatically rather than lay off their entire workforce. Hours were slashed too, full-time positions became part-time, and even part-time work came with unpredictable, ever-shifting schedules. Workers never knew from week to week how many hours they'd actually get, which made budgeting for basic necessities like food and rent nearly impossible. Some industries cut wages by 30 or 40%. Others simply stopped offering consistent shifts altogether, leaving workers scrambling to piece together enough hours across multiple jobs just to survive. This created a strange, unsettling category of American worker, employed on paper, but genuinely impoverished in practice. Labor unions, already weakened by the broader economic collapse, struggled to fight back against these reductions. Workers who complained too loudly risked losing their jobs entirely, so many simply endured the pay cuts silently, grateful just to have any income at all in a country where so many had none. Number 10. The Bonus Army. In the summer of 1932, thousands of World War I veterans and their families marched on Washington, D.C. They were demanding early payment of bonuses the government had promised them years earlier, certificates that weren't actually scheduled to pay out until 1945. With the Depression crushing their finances, these veterans desperately needed that money immediately, not more than a decade later. Roughly 15,000 to 20,000 veterans set up camp in and around the Capitol, building makeshift shelters out of whatever materials they could find. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, and their protest was largely peaceful, organized, and disciplined. They simply wanted Congress to accelerate payment of money they'd already been promised for their military service. The Senate ultimately rejected the bonus bill, leaving thousands of veteran families camped out in the Capitol with nowhere else to go and no resolution to their demands. What happened next would become one of the more shameful chapters of the era, a moment where the federal government's response to its own struggling veterans revealed just how far authorities were willing to go. Number 11. The Bonus Army Eviction. When many veterans refused to leave Washington after their bonus bill failed, the federal government sent in the military to clear them out. Army troops, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, used tear gas, bayonets, and cavalry to forcibly remove the veterans and their families from their encampments. Tanks were reportedly involved in the operation as well. The makeshift shelters these veterans had built, tents and shacks made from scrap materials, were set on fire during the eviction, leaving the encampments in smoking ruins. Women and children were among those affected by the tear gas and chaos. Several veterans were injured, and reports at the time suggested at least a couple of deaths resulted from the confrontation, though exact figures remain debated by historians. The imagery was devastating. American soldiers using force against American veterans who had served their country and were now simply asking for money already owed to them. Public opinion largely turned against the government's handling of the situation. The event became a symbol of how desperate and mishandled the Depression response could be, even when the people asking for help had literally fought for the nation doing the mishandling. Number 12. Hoovervilles. As homelessness spread across the country, displaced families began building makeshift shantytowns out of whatever materials they could scavenge: scrap wood, sheets of metal, cardboard, canvas, anything that could provide some shelter from the weather. These settlements sprang up near major cities all across America, often on unused land, in parks, or along riverbanks. They became known as Hoovervilles, a bitter nod to President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for failing to adequately address the economic crisis. The name itself reflected the public's frustration and desperation during those years. Life in a Hooverville meant no running water, no electricity, no sanitation, families crowded together in shacks barely large enough to stand in. Yet these makeshift communities often developed their own informal structures, shared resources, mutual aid, even rough forms of local leadership among residents trying to survive together. Some Hoovervilles grew quite large, housing hundreds or even thousands of displaced people at their peak. They existed in cities across the country, from Seattle to New York, visible daily reminders of just how far the economic collapse had pushed ordinary American families. For many children growing up during this period, a Hooverville wasn't a historical footnote. It was simply home. Number 13, breadlines. Picture a line stretching for blocks, men in worn coats and hats standing silently for hours, sometimes in freezing weather, just for the chance at a single meal. These breadlines formed outside churches, missions, and charity kitchens in nearly every American city during the worst years of the Depression. The wait could last from early morning until well past noon, and there was never a guarantee the food would last until you reached the front. Photographs from this era became some of the most enduring images of the entire Depression. Rows of anonymous faces united by hunger, rather than any single circumstance. Business owners, former professionals, laborers, they all stood in the same line because unemployment didn't discriminate by resume. Some cities saw lines with thousands of people waiting at once. The psychological weight of standing in a bread line shouldn't be underestimated either. For many Americans raised on ideas of self-reliance and hard work, accepting charity felt deeply shameful, even when it was the only option left. Newspapers of the time documented men turning their collars up and looking away from cameras, embarrassed to be seen needing help. Yet these lines also became a strange kind of community, strangers sharing cigarettes, rumors about which factory might be hiring, or which mission served the biggest portions. Breadlines weren't just about food. They were a daily, visible reckoning with just how widespread the suffering had become, a reminder that dignity and survival were often forced into direct competition with one another. Number 14, soup kitchens. While breadlines got people to a location, soup kitchens were often where the actual meals happened, run by churches, charities, and sometimes even wealthy individuals who wanted to help however they could. One of the more surprising sponsors was gangster Al Capone, who funded a Chicago soup kitchen in 1930, feeding thousands of people daily, partly out of genuine charity and partly as clever public relations. Government relief during the early years of the Depression remained limited, so private organizations carried an enormous share of the burden. Volunteers ladled out simple, filling meals, often little more than broth, bread, and whatever vegetables could be donated or purchased cheaply in bulk. Some kitchens served hundreds of meals a day. Others, in larger cities, served thousands. The Salvation Army and various religious organizations became lifelines for entire neighborhoods, sometimes operating with barely enough supplies to make it through a single day before needing more donations. Volunteers themselves were often struggling too, giving their time even while facing their own uncertain finances. These kitchens couldn't solve the deeper economic collapse, obviously, but they kept countless families from outright starvation during years when government relief programs were still being developed and debated in Washington. It's worth remembering that before federal relief programs expanded under later New Deal initiatives, it was largely local charity, churches, and even, apparently organized crime, holding together the thin thread between hunger and survival for millions of desperate Americans across the country. Number 15, apple sellers. In the fall of 1930, the International Apple Shippers Association found itself with a massive surplus of unsold apples and came up with an idea: sell them on credit to unemployed men who could then resell them on street corners for a nickel each. Almost overnight, apple sellers appeared on sidewalks across major American cities, standing next to small wooden crates, offering a simple piece of fruit to passers-by. At its peak, an estimated 6,000 apple sellers worked the streets of New York City alone. The image became an unmistakable symbol of the Depression. A formerly employed man, often in a suit that had seen better days, standing on a corner trying to scrape together a few cents through fruit sales. It wasn't much of a living. Most sellers made barely enough to cover their own expenses, let alone support a family. But it offered something psychologically important: a small sense of independence and purpose rather than standing in a bread line waiting for charity. Newspapers and photographers captured these sellers constantly, turning them into a nationwide shorthand for economic collapse. Even people who never personally sold or bought an apple during the Depression understood exactly what an apple seller represented. It's a strange thing, how such a small, humble act, selling fruit on a street corner, became one of the most recognizable visual symbols of an entire decade of national suffering. capturing both the desperation of the moment and a stubborn refusal to give up entirely on self-sufficiency. Number 16, eviction squads. When families couldn't pay rent, which was increasingly common as unemployment climbed, landlords called in eviction squads, sometimes accompanied by local police, to physically remove tenants and their belongings from their homes. Furniture, beds, dishes, family photographs, everything would be carried out and left on the sidewalk or curb, often in full view of neighbors and passersby. These evictions happened with startling frequency in cities across the country, and they became such a common sight that entire neighborhoods developed informal responses to them. In several documented cases, once the eviction squad left, neighbors would gather and quietly move the family's furniture right back into the apartment or house before the landlord could relock the doors. Sometimes this happened multiple times at the same address, a kind of low-grade standoff between desperate tenants and landlords who were themselves often struggling to cover their own mortgages. Community organizations and even early tenant unions in some cities organized more formal resistance, showing up in numbers to physically block evictions from happening at all. These weren't isolated protests either. In New York City alone, thousands of evictions took place during the worst years of the Depression, and organized resistance to them became one of the more grassroots forms of activism to emerge from the crisis. It reflected something important about the era, that even when institutions failed people completely, communities sometimes stepped in to fill the gap, even if just temporarily, and even if it meant defying landlords, police, and the law itself. Number 17, foreclosure auctions. As farm income collapsed alongside crop prices throughout the early 1930s, many farmers found themselves unable to keep up with mortgage payments, leading banks to force property into foreclosure auctions. These sales were meant to recoup whatever money the bank could get by selling the land to the highest bidder. But in numerous farming communities, neighbors organized themselves to prevent outside buyers from ever getting the chance to bid competitively. Sometimes this meant a crowd showing up and intimidating potential buyers into staying silent. Other times it involved more direct pressure, threats, or simply overwhelming numbers making it clear that bidding against a neighbor wouldn't be tolerated. These gatherings became known in some regions as penny auctions, though that specific practice deserves its own explanation. The broader foreclosure crisis devastated rural America throughout the Depression, with hundreds of thousands of farms lost to the banks during the decade. For families who had worked the same land for generations, watching it get auctioned off for pennies on the dollar represented not just financial ruin but a kind of generational heartbreak. Farm organizations and rural protest movements emerged directly out of this crisis, some advocating peaceful resistance, others pushing for more aggressive legislative solutions like debt moratorium laws. The sheer scale of agricultural foreclosure during this period reshaped rural America permanently, pushing many former farm owners into tenancy or off the land entirely, contributing to migration patterns that would define the decade's second half. Number 18, penny auctions. Building directly on that spirit of community resistance, some farming communities developed a specific and clever tactic to fight back against foreclosure: the penny auction. Here's how it worked. When a foreclosed farm went up for sale, neighbors would show up in large numbers and make sure that nobody bid a fair price for the property. Through intimidation, solidarity, or sometimes outright threats of violence, they'd ensure the only bids submitted were absurdly low, sometimes just a few cents for an entire farm complete with land, buildings, and equipment. Once the property sold for essentially nothing, the winning bidder, who was often a friend or relative of the original owner arranged in advance, would immediately return the deed to the family who just lost it. Banks and auctioneers found themselves essentially powerless in these situations, since technically nothing illegal was happening, just a legal auction where everyone happened to bid absurdly low amounts. These penny auctions became a genuine form of grassroots resistance across farm states like Iowa and Nebraska, representing rural America's refusal to simply accept its fate quietly. They required real courage, since defying banks and their hired representatives carried genuine risk. But they also revealed something important about how communities responded when formal systems failed them entirely. When the government and financial institutions couldn't or wouldn't help, ordinary people found inventive, sometimes legally questionable ways to protect their neighbors, turning collective action into one of the few effective tools available against economic forces that felt otherwise impossible to fight. Number 19, the farm debt crisis. Long before the Dust Bowl turned the sky brown, American farmers were already drowning, not in dust but in debt. During the 1920s, many farmers had taken out loans to expand operations, buy equipment, or purchase more land, banking on crop prices staying high. When the Depression hit, prices for wheat, corn, and cotton collapsed far faster than anyone anticipated, sometimes falling by more than half within a couple of years. Mortgage payments, however, stayed exactly the same. A farmer who once needed 10 bushels of wheat to cover a loan payment might suddenly need 20 or 30 just to make the same amount of money. Banks, many of which were themselves struggling to stay solvent, had little patience for missed payments and began foreclosing on farms at an alarming rate. By the mid-1930s, hundreds of thousands of farms had changed hands through forced sale, often for a fraction of their actual value. This wasn't a regional problem either. It stretched across the Midwest, the South, and the Great Plains, touching nearly every agricultural community in the country. Farm organizations sprang up demanding debt relief, moratorium laws, and government intervention, arguing that farmers were being punished for economic forces entirely outside their control. The crisis reshaped rural America permanently, pushing countless families out of ownership and into tenancy, sharecropping, or migration, setting the stage for even harder years still to come. Number 20. Milk strikes. As farm income kept shrinking, dairy farmers found themselves in a particularly cruel bind. Milk spoils quickly, so unlike grain, it can't simply be stored and sold later when prices improve. In several Midwestern states, especially Wisconsin and Iowa, dairy farmers organized strikes in the early 1930s, refusing to deliver milk to processing plants and distributors until prices rose to a level that actually covered production costs. Some farmers blocked roads to prevent other farmers from delivering their milk, hoping to force a unified front. In more dramatic instances, striking farmers dumped thousands of gallons of milk onto highways rather than sell it at a loss, a striking and somewhat wasteful image of protest during a period when so many people were going hungry. The strikes sometimes turned violent, with clashes between strikers and those attempting to cross picket lines, occasionally involving state police or National Guard troops called in to keep roads open. These milk strikes reflected a broader frustration among farmers who felt trapped by a system where they had no control over prices, yet all the risk of production fell squarely on their shoulders. While the strikes didn't always achieve their immediate goals, they highlighted just how desperate rural communities had become and added pressure on lawmakers to consider agricultural relief programs. It's a strange irony that, in a nation full of hungry people, some farmers felt their only leverage was destroying the very food others desperately needed. Number 21. The Dust Bowl. Layered on top of the economic collapse came an environmental disaster that turned an already dire situation into something closer to biblical. Years of drought combined with farming practices that stripped away natural grasses across the Great Plains left the soil with nothing to hold it in place. When strong winds swept through, they picked up enormous amounts of topsoil, creating massive dust storms that could stretch for hundreds of miles and block out the sun for hours at a time. States like Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico were hit especially hard, an area that became known as the Dust Bowl. Families watched helplessly as their fields, sometimes representing generations of work, simply blew away in the wind. Dust seeped into homes through window frames and door cracks, coating furniture, food, and bedding, no matter how tightly a house was sealed. Livestock sometimes suffocated from inhaling too much dust, and crops that hadn't already failed from lack of rain were often buried entirely. The combination of ecological mismanagement and severe drought created a disaster that compounded the financial devastation farmers were already facing from collapsed prices and mounting debt. It's worth noting that not every farmer contributed equally to the soil erosion, and drought conditions played a significant natural role as well, but the result was the same regardless of cause. A landscape turned hostile to the people trying to survive on it. Number 22. Black Sunday. On April 14, 1935, one of the worst dust storms in American history rolled across the Great Plains with terrifying speed and force. Witnesses described watching a massive black wall of dust approaching from the horizon, sometimes reportedly rising thousands of feet into the sky, blotting out daylight as it moved. People caught outdoors when the storm hit described being unable to see their own hands in front of their faces. Temperatures reportedly dropped suddenly as the storm passed, and static electricity generated by the dust particles was strong enough to knock people down or short out car engines. Farmers and families huddled inside homes, stuffing wet towels under doors and around windows in a desperate attempt to keep the suffocating dust out, though it rarely worked completely. The storm affected a huge swath of the Plain States, and news of its severity spread quickly, becoming a defining moment that helped cement public awareness of just how catastrophic conditions had become in the region. It was actually a journalist covering the storm, Robert Geiger, who is credited with coining the term Dust Bowl shortly afterward, giving a name to the disaster that had been building for years. Black Sunday didn't cause the environmental collapse on its own, but it stood as a dramatic, terrifying symbol of just how far things had deteriorated, convincing many Plains families that leaving might be their only remaining option. Number 23. Dust pneumonia. The relentless dust storms sweeping across the plains didn't just damage crops and homes. They damaged lungs. Fine particles of dirt, sometimes mixed with sand and debris, worked their way into people's respiratory systems, especially affecting young children and the elderly whose lungs were more vulnerable. Doctors at the time began describing severe respiratory cases as dust pneumonia, a condition where inhaled dust caused inflammation and infection deep within the lungs. Hospitals in the hardest hit areas reported rising numbers of respiratory illnesses during and after major storms, and some counties saw noticeable increases in deaths attributed to pneumonia and related complications during the worst Dust Bowl years. Treatment options were limited at the time, and prevention mostly meant trying to keep dust out of homes entirely, an almost impossible task given how fine and persistent the particles were. Families sometimes covered children's faces with damp cloths, just to get them safely between buildings during a storm. The medical toll of the Dust Bowl often gets overshadowed by the economic and agricultural devastation, but for the people living through it, the physical health risks were very real and frightening. It added another layer of urgency to an already desperate situation, since staying on the land didn't just risk financial ruin anymore. It risked the health and even the lives of family members, particularly the youngest and oldest among them. Number 24. The Okie migration. Faced with failed crops, foreclosed farms, and worsening health conditions, hundreds of thousands of families packed up whatever belongings would fit into a car or truck and headed west, hoping California's agricultural economy might offer work and a fresh start. These migrants became broadly known as Okies, a term technically referring to people from Oklahoma, though in reality migrants came from Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, Missouri, and other affected states as well. The journey itself was grueling, often taking Route 66 across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain in vehicles that weren't always reliable enough for the trip. Upon arrival in California, many migrants found conditions far different from what they'd hoped: overcrowded labor camps, low wages for backbreaking agricultural work, and often open hostility from local communities who viewed the newcomers with suspicion or resentment. Some California towns even attempted to block migrants from entering, treating them as an unwanted burden rather than fellow citizens simply seeking work. Author John Steinbeck captured much of this experience in his novel The Grapes of Wrath, drawing both acclaim and controversy for portraying the migrants' hardships so vividly. The Okie migration represented one of the largest internal migrations in American history up to that point, forever reshaping California's agricultural workforce and leaving a lasting cultural memory of resilience in the face of nearly total displacement. Number 25. California labor camps. For the Okies and other migrants who made it west chasing rumors of steady agricultural work, the reality waiting for them often looked nothing like the promised land they'd imagined. Migrant families frequently ended up in makeshift labor camps scattered across California's Central Valley, tent cities and shanty towns built from whatever scrap materials families could scrounge together. Clean water was scarce, sanitation was minimal, and disease spread easily through camps housing hundreds or even thousands of people in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Wages for picking cotton, fruit, or vegetables were set incredibly low, partly because growers knew there were always more desperate families arriving daily, willing to work for whatever they could get. This oversupply of labor meant workers had almost no leverage to demand better pay or conditions, since refusing to work simply meant someone else would take the job instead. Some larger growers ran their own camps, controlling not just wages but also housing, prices at company stores, and essentially every aspect of a worker's daily life. Government agencies eventually established a handful of cleaner, better regulated camps offering some relief, though these never came close to meeting the actual demand. Photographers and writers documenting these camps helped bring national attention to the conditions migrant families endured, adding pressure for eventual labor reforms. But for the families actually living through it, government studies and photographs offered little comfort while they were struggling just to keep their children fed and healthy in camps never designed for anything resembling a decent life. And speaking of families uprooted and treated as unwelcome outsiders during the Depression, an entirely different group faced organized pressure to leave the country altogether. Number 26. The 1930s deportation drives. As jobs grew scarcer and public anxiety rose, local governments, federal agencies, and even private organizations across the country began pushing for the removal of Mexican and Mexican-American residents, often under the justification that they were taking jobs away from other Americans. These efforts, sometimes called Mexican repatriation, involved raids on workplaces, public gathering spots, and neighborhoods, with authorities rounding up individuals and pressuring or forcing them onto trains and buses headed south across the border. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million people were removed from the United States during this period, though exact numbers remain difficult to pin down given inconsistent record-keeping at the time. Some cities, including Los Angeles, conducted highly visible sweeps specifically targeting Mexican communities, often with little regard for due process or individual circumstances. Local relief agencies sometimes offered free train tickets south, framed as a humane solution, though the underlying pressure to leave was rarely subtle or voluntary. Many families felt they had little real choice given the combination of economic desperation, social hostility, and active government encouragement to depart. The scale and coordination of these removal efforts varied significantly by region, but the overall pattern reflected a broader climate of scapegoating minority communities during economic hardship. It's a chapter of Depression-era history that received relatively little attention for decades afterward, overshadowed by other aspects of the era's economic story. And speaking of the human cost hidden within those deportation numbers, the story gets even more complicated once you look closely at exactly who was being sent away. Number 27. Citizen deportations. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Mexican repatriation efforts is that a significant portion of the people removed were not actually Mexican citizens at all, but American citizens by birth. Children born in the United States to Mexican immigrant parents were, under the Constitution, citizens themselves, yet many were swept up in raids and sent across the border alongside their parents, regardless of their legal status. Some estimates suggest that as many as 60% of those repatriated during this period were United States citizens, a staggering figure given the constitutional protections that were supposed to apply to them. These children often arrived in Mexico speaking primarily English, unfamiliar with the culture, and legally entitled to return to the country of their birth, though few had any realistic means of doing so. Families were frequently separated during the process, with some members detained while others fled or were left behind. Local officials rarely distinguished carefully between documented residents, undocumented immigrants, and citizens during these operations, prioritizing speed and visible results over legal accuracy. It would take decades before any formal acknowledgement of this injustice occurred, and even then, recognition came slowly and unevenly across different states. California eventually issued a formal apology in 2005, decades after the fact, acknowledging the wrongful removal of its own citizens during a period of economic panic and prejudice. And speaking of Americans denied basic fairness during the Depression simply because of who they were, Black workers faced their own devastating set of obstacles. Number 28. Black unemployment disparities. While unemployment during the Depression was devastating for nearly everyone, it hit Black communities with particular severity. In many cities, Black unemployment rates ran significantly higher than white unemployment rates, sometimes nearly double, reflecting deep patterns of discrimination that predated the economic collapse but intensified dramatically once jobs became scarce. Many industries that had previously employed Black workers, even in limited capacities, began replacing them with white workers as competition for any available position increased. Labor unions, which might have offered some protection or negotiating power, frequently excluded Black workers from membership entirely, leaving them without meaningful representation during layoffs or wage disputes. Federal relief programs, while providing crucial assistance to millions, were often administered locally, meaning discriminatory practices could and did influence who received aid, how much, and how quickly. In many southern states, relief payments to black families were set noticeably lower than payments to white families for comparable circumstances. Even skilled black workers with experience and qualifications often found themselves passed over in favor of less experienced white applicants, simply due to prevailing social attitudes about who deserved employment during hard times. These disparities compounded existing economic disadvantages that black Americans already faced due to decades of systemic barriers to education, property ownership, and fair employment. The Depression didn't create these inequalities, but it intensified them considerably, deepening economic gaps that would persist for generations afterward. And speaking of the particular vulnerability black workers faced when it came time to hand out pink slips, there was actually a phrase for exactly that pattern. Number 29, last hired, first fired. This phrase became something of an informal shorthand during the Depression era to describe the employment pattern facing black workers across much of the country. It captured a simple but painful reality. Black applicants were often the last considered when companies were hiring, and the first let go when companies needed to cut staff, regardless of seniority, performance, or qualifications. This pattern showed up across a wide range of industries, from manufacturing and construction to domestic service and retail work. Even during brief periods of economic improvement throughout the 1930s, black workers often found themselves excluded from the earliest waves of rehiring, watching white coworkers return to jobs while they remained unemployed. Civil rights organizations and black newspapers at the time frequently highlighted this pattern, using it to draw attention to the discrimination embedded within supposedly neutral hiring and layoff decisions. Some employers openly acknowledged race as a factor in these decisions, while others framed their choices using seemingly race-neutral language that nonetheless produced consistently discriminatory outcomes. The phrase itself would go on to have a long life well beyond the Depression, resurfacing during later economic downturns as a way of describing similar patterns of racial disparity in employment. It stands as a stark reminder that economic hardship, while widespread, was never distributed evenly, and that existing social inequalities shaped who bore the heaviest burdens during the nation's worst financial crisis. And speaking of protections that failed to reach everyone equally, even the New Deal's signature achievement had troubling gaps built into its foundation. Number 30, domestic workers excluded. When Social Security was established in 1935, it represented a genuinely groundbreaking shift in how the federal government approached economic security for aging and vulnerable Americans. But the original law contained significant exclusions that disproportionately affected certain groups of workers, particularly domestic servants and agricultural laborers. These two categories happened to include a very large percentage of black workers in the 1930s, especially in southern states where domestic and farm labor made up a substantial portion of black employment. Because these workers were excluded from the program entirely, they had no access to the retirement benefits, unemployment insurance, or other protections that Social Security offered to workers in covered industries. Some historians and researchers have argued that these exclusions were, at least in part, a deliberate concession made to secure the votes of Southern lawmakers who were unwilling to support a program that might benefit black workers equally alongside white workers. Others point out that these categories were simply difficult to administer and tax accurately given how informally domestic and agricultural work was often structured. Regardless of the exact reasoning, the practical effect was clear. Millions of workers, many of them among the most economically vulnerable people in the country, were left without a safety net precisely when they needed one most. It would take decades of legislative changes before domestic and agricultural workers gained the same coverage other American workers had received from the very beginning. Number 31. Lynching during the Depression. You'd think a nation consumed by breadlines and bank failures might have had less energy for racial violence, but that wasn't the case. Lynchings continued throughout the 1930s, particularly across southern states, even as newspapers filled their pages with unemployment statistics and New Deal announcements. Economic desperation seemed to intensify racial tensions in many communities, rather than diminish them, as competition for scarce jobs and resources gave already prejudiced attitudes an added edge of hostility. Organizations like the NAACP worked tirelessly during this period to document these killings and push for federal anti-lynching legislation. compiling detailed records precisely because local law enforcement so often refused to investigate or prosecute. Bills aimed at making lynching a federal crime were introduced in Congress multiple times throughout the decade, and every single one failed, largely due to Southern lawmakers using procedural tactics like filibusters to block passage. President Roosevelt, despite public sympathy for the cause, declined to publicly champion these bills, worried that doing so would cost him crucial Southern political support he needed for his broader economic agenda. So the violence continued largely unchecked by federal law, tracked mostly by activists and journalists rather than government statistics. It's a sobering reminder that the story of the Depression wasn't only about economic suffering. For many Americans, physical safety itself remained precarious, regardless of what was happening with the stock market or unemployment lines. And speaking of economic arrangements that trapped people no matter how hard they worked, sharecropping deserves its own uncomfortable spotlight. Number 32. Sharecropper poverty. Sharecropping had existed since the end of slavery, but the Depression exposed just how brutally exploitative this system could be. Under this arrangement, tenant farmers, disproportionately black, but including many white families too, worked land owned by someone else in exchange for a share of the crop at harvest time. In theory, it sounded reasonable enough. In practice, landlords controlled virtually every part of the transaction, from the seed and tools farmers had to purchase on credit to the prices assigned to their harvested crops. Many landlords also ran the local stores, where sharecroppers were required to buy supplies throughout the year, again on credit, at prices the landlord alone determined. When settlement day arrived, the accounting almost always seemed to favor the landowner, leaving families owing more than they'd earned despite months of grueling labor. This created a cycle of debt that trapped generations of families on the same land, unable to leave because they legally or practically couldn't pay off what they supposedly owed. Falling crop prices during the Depression made this system even more punishing, since the same amount of labor now produced dramatically less income. Families worked entire growing seasons only to end up further in debt than when they started. It was a system designed less around fair compensation and more around perpetual obligation. And speaking of sharecroppers who eventually decided enough was enough, some of them actually organized to fight back. Number 33, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. In 1934, something genuinely remarkable happened in rural Arkansas. Black and white tenant farmers, groups that Southern society worked hard to keep divided, came together to form a labor union advocating for fair treatment. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union organized sharecroppers and tenant farmers to demand better contracts, fairer crop divisions, and protection against arbitrary evictions. This kind of interracial cooperation was almost unheard of in the Jim Crow South, and it deeply unsettled powerful landowners who depended on racial division to maintain control over their labor force. The union faced fierce and often violent opposition. Organizers were beaten, meetings were broken up by armed men, and members faced eviction from the very land they worked simply for daring to organize. Local law enforcement frequently sided with landowners, offering little protection to union members facing intimidation or physical harm. Despite this resistance, the union grew, eventually claiming tens of thousands of members across several states. It brought national attention to the plight of tenant farmers, pressuring federal agencies to address some of the worst abuses within New Deal agricultural programs. The union story remains a striking example of solidarity crossing racial lines during an era defined largely by division, even if that solidarity came at a steep and often violent cost. And speaking of tenant farmers pushed to their absolute limit, one particular protest in Missouri became impossible for the country to ignore. Number 34, the 1937 Missouri Boothiel Strike. As New Deal agricultural policies encouraged landowners to reduce crop production, many chose the cheapest possible way to comply, evicting their tenant farmers entirely rather than sharing reduced payments with them. In January of 1937, hundreds of evicted sharecropper families in Missouri's Boothiel region found themselves suddenly homeless in the dead of winter, with nowhere else to go. In a dramatic and highly visible act of protest, these families gathered their few belongings and set up makeshift camps directly alongside major highways, forcing passing motorists and reporters to confront the human cost of agricultural policy decisions made far away in Washington. Photographs of families huddled under tents and tarps in freezing temperatures spread across newspapers nationwide, generating public sympathy and considerable political embarrassment. State officials eventually forced the protesters to relocate away from the roadside, but the images had already done their work, drawing national attention to how New Deal farm programs sometimes worsened conditions for the very people they claimed to help. The protests highlighted a painful irony. Government efforts designed to stabilize agricultural markets ended up displacing some of the most vulnerable people working within that system, families who had no cushion whatsoever to absorb the disruption. And speaking of families forced into difficult decisions during the Depression, young women often bore burdens that history books rarely emphasize. Number 35. Women leaving school as household finances collapsed across the country. Countless young women left school early, not because they lacked ability or ambition, but because their families desperately needed additional income or extra hands at home. Older daughters frequently took on responsibilities like caring for younger siblings, managing household chores, or finding whatever paid work they could locate, freeing up other family members to search for jobs elsewhere. In many cases, families prioritized keeping sons enrolled in school longer than daughters, reflecting prevailing assumptions about whose education mattered more for the family's long-term economic future. Some young women found work in domestic service, textile mills, or as informal caregivers, taking whatever wages they could contribute toward keeping their families afloat. Others stayed home entirely, taking over cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing duties that allowed parents to work longer hours elsewhere. This educational disruption had lasting consequences, limiting future job opportunities and earning potential for an entire generation of women who might otherwise have completed more schooling under different economic circumstances. It's a quieter, less dramatic story than bank failures or dust storms, but it shaped countless individual lives in ways that rippled forward for decades afterward. And speaking of women facing limited options during the Depression, married women encountered a particularly frustrating form of workplace discrimination. Number 36. Married women job bans. As unemployment climbed and available jobs grew scarce, a curious kind of logic took hold across many businesses and government offices. If work was limited, the thinking went, married women shouldn't be competing for it at all, since they presumably had husbands to support them financially. This assumption led many employers, along with some state and local governments, to implement outright bans on hiring or retaining married women in certain positions. Teaching was one of the most heavily affected professions, with numerous school districts adopting policies that required women to resign from their jobs once they got married. Some federal legislation reinforced this thinking as well, discouraging the employment of married individuals when their spouse already held a government job, a policy that overwhelmingly affected women rather than men. These restrictions rested on the assumption that families needed only one income earner and that scarce jobs should go to men supporting households, an assumption that ignored the reality that many married women worked precisely because their husbands were unemployed or earning insufficient wages. The policies pushed skilled, experienced women out of steady employment during a period when every household desperately needed whatever income it could gather, revealing just how deeply gender assumptions shaped economic policy even during the nation's most severe financial crisis. Number 37. The marriage rate collapse. One of the quieter casualties of the Great Depression was something as fundamental as getting married. Throughout the 1920s, marriage rates had climbed steadily, but once the economy collapsed, so did the willingness of young couples to formalize their relationships. Setting up an independent household required money for rent, furniture, and basic necessities, resources that simply didn't exist for millions of Americans struggling just to feed themselves. So couples waited. Engagements stretched on for years. Some young men refused to propose at all until they felt confident they could actually support a wife, a confidence that proved elusive throughout most of the decade. Sociologists and demographers at the time noted the trend with concern, worrying about what delayed marriage meant for social stability and traditional family formation. Newspapers ran stories about long engagements that never quite reached the altar, and rural communities in particular saw sharp declines in wedding announcements. It wasn't that Americans stopped falling in love or wanting families. It was that the economic foundation required to build those families had crumbled beneath them. The marriage rate wouldn't fully recover until the economy itself showed sustained improvement later in the decade. And speaking of decisions couples faced once they did marry, another deeply personal choice was being reshaped by economic hardship as well. Number 38. Falling birth rates. Just as marriage rates dropped, so did the number of children being born, and for remarkably similar reasons. Raising a child cost money, and money was precisely what most American families lacked during the 1930s. Couples who might otherwise have started families or expanded existing ones made the difficult choice to wait, hoping conditions would improve before bringing another mouth to feed into an already strained household. Birth control information, while still limited and controversial in many states, became more actively sought out as families tried to exercise whatever control they could over their circumstances. Economists and social observers at the time linked the declining birth rate directly to unemployment statistics, noting that the hardest hit regions often saw the steepest drops in births. This wasn't a temporary blip either. The Depression-era birth decline was significant enough that it created a noticeably smaller generation, one that would later be dwarfed by the population boom following World War II. Families weren't abandoning the idea of children altogether. They were simply responding rationally to an economy that offered no guarantees, postponing parenthood until the ground beneath them felt slightly more stable. And speaking of children who were already born into these hardships, some of them ended up working far earlier than anyone would have wished. Number 39. Child labor's return. Decades of reform efforts had gradually pushed child labor out of American factories and mines, but the Depression quietly reversed some of that progress in less visible ways. Formal factory employment of children remained illegal in most states, but desperate families found other avenues where enforcement was thin or non-existent. Children sold newspapers on street corners, shined shoes, ran errands, and worked alongside parents in family businesses or on farms for hours that would alarm modern observers. Agricultural work in particular relied heavily on informal child labor, since farm work often fell outside the reach of existing labor protections. Migrant farming families frequently pulled children out of school entirely during harvest seasons, needing every available set of hands just to survive. Reformers pushed back, and some New Deal legislation eventually addressed industrial child labor more firmly, but informal and agricultural labor remained largely unregulated throughout the decade. For many families, the choice wasn't between child labor and no child labor. It was between a child working and a family going hungry, a calculation that reformers with good intentions rarely had to make themselves. And speaking of families going hungry, the food that did make it onto Depression-era tables often left a great deal to be desired nutritionally. Number 40. Malnutrition. Feeding a family during the Depression frequently meant prioritizing quantity over quality and starchy, filling foods over anything resembling balanced nutrition. Bread, potatoes, and beans became dietary staples precisely because they were cheap and could stretch a limited budget across many meals. Meat, fresh fruit, vegetables, and dairy products were often treated as occasional luxuries rather than everyday necessities. Doctors and public health officials documented rising rates of malnutrition among children in particular, noting signs like stunted growth, fatigue, and weakened resistance to common illnesses. Medical care itself became something families deferred, since visiting a doctor cost money that could otherwise buy food for the week. Public health nurses working in poor communities regularly reported children arriving at school without having eaten breakfast, relying entirely on subsidized school lunch programs that emerged partly in response to this crisis. The relationship between poverty and poor nutrition wasn't subtle or hidden. It played out visibly in hospital records, school health screenings, and the simple physical appearance of children across the country, offering a sobering counterpoint to any narrative that framed the Depression purely in terms of statistics and stock prices. And speaking of diet-related consequences that went far beyond simple hunger, one particular disease became a genuine public health crisis in poor communities. Number 41. Pellagra. Pellagra, a disease caused by severe niacin deficiency, became disturbingly common among poor families during the Depression, particularly across the rural South where diets relied heavily on corn-based staples lacking essential nutrients. The symptoms were brutal, often summarized by doctors using the phrase the 4Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death if left untreated. Entire communities saw outbreaks tied directly to poverty and limited dietary variety, since families simply couldn't afford the fresh meat, milk, and vegetables that would have prevented the deficiency. Public health researchers, including Dr. Joseph Goldberger, years earlier, had already established the dietary link. Yet economic circumstances during the Depression made prevention nearly impossible for millions of families. Government relief programs eventually began addressing nutritional education and food distribution, partly in response to pellagra's visibility as a genuine crisis rather than an isolated medical curiosity. Still, thousands of cases were documented throughout the decade, a stark reminder that poverty didn't just cause hunger in the abstract sense. It caused specific, diagnosable, and sometimes fatal medical conditions that doctors could trace directly back to what families could or couldn't afford to put on their tables each night. And speaking of medical conditions families couldn't afford to address, healthcare itself became something increasingly out of reach for ordinary Americans. Number 42, untreated illness. When every dollar had to stretch toward rent and food, medical care frequently fell to the bottom of the priority list, regardless of how serious a symptom might be. Families delayed doctor visits, ignored persistent coughs, rationed prescribed medications, or simply hoped illnesses would resolve on their own rather than face bills they couldn't possibly pay. Dental care in particular was often abandoned entirely, with tooth extraction becoming a common alternative to more expensive treatments. Hospitals reported that patients frequently arrived only when conditions had progressed to emergency status, having avoided care for weeks or months beforehand. Public health officials expressed growing concern about untreated chronic conditions, especially among children, whose long-term health outcomes suffered from delayed intervention during these critical developmental years. Some communities organized free clinics or relied on charitable medical services, but these resources were stretched impossibly thin against overwhelming demand. The result was a generation of Americans who carried the physical consequences of Depression-era healthcare avoidance well into later decades, a quiet and often invisible toll that never made headlines the way bank failures or unemployment lines did, but shaped individual lives just as profoundly. Number 43. Suicide fears. The Great Depression carved itself into the American psyche, partly through a persistent and haunting anxiety around suicide, an association that has endured in popular memory ever since. Newspapers of the era did report tragic cases, sometimes linked to financial ruin, bankruptcy, or the shame of sudden poverty after years of comfort. The image of a broken businessman leaping from a Wall Street window became a cultural shorthand for the crash itself, even though historians have since noted that this specific image was often exaggerated in popular retelling. Actual suicide statistics from the period are more complicated than the popular narrative suggests, with rates varying considerably by region, year, and demographic group, and some scholars cautioning against oversimplified cause and effect conclusions. What is clear is that the psychological toll of sudden poverty, unemployment, and lost social status weighed heavily on many Americans, and public health officials at the time did express genuine concern about rising emotional distress. Mental health support as we understand it today barely existed, leaving families to cope with grief and despair largely in isolation. The fear of financial ruin leading to suicide became a defining emotional undercurrent of the decade, whether or not every statistic fully supported the more dramatic stories that circulated in newspapers and later folklore. And speaking of dangers lurking beneath the surface of everyday Depression-era life, organized crime added its own layer of violence to an already anxious decade. Number 44. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre era. Before the stock market crash fully reshaped American life, Prohibition had already created a thriving underground economy built around illegal alcohol, and the violence that came with it didn't simply disappear once the Depression began. The infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago back in 1929 had already shown the public just how brutal rival bootlegging operations could become, with rival gang members gunned down in a garage in an event that shocked the nation. As economic desperation deepened through the early 30s, organized crime networks often expanded their influence, offering illegal income opportunities to Americans who had few other options for survival. Bootlegging, gambling operations, and other underground enterprises persisted in cities across the country, sometimes providing employment even as legitimate industries collapsed around them. Public fear of gangster violence remained high throughout the early Depression years, fueled by sensational newspaper coverage and the rise of notorious figures whose names became household knowledge. This uneasy coexistence between desperate poverty and organized criminal enterprise added yet another layer of instability to a society already reeling from economic collapse, reminding Americans that hardship could breed both quiet suffering and violent opportunism in equal measure. And speaking of Prohibition's tangled relationship with the Depression economy, that entire chapter of American law was about to come to an end. Number 45, Prohibition's end. By the time Franklin Roosevelt took office, growing numbers of Americans and lawmakers alike had concluded that Prohibition was doing more economic harm than moral good. The 21st Amendment, ratified in December of 1933, officially repealed Prohibition, ending the nationwide ban on alcohol that had been in place since 1920. The reasoning behind repeal wasn't purely about personal freedom or changing social attitudes toward drinking, though those factors certainly played a role. It was also deeply practical. Legalizing alcohol meant new tax revenue for cash-strapped state and federal governments, along with legitimate jobs in breweries, distilleries, and bars that had previously operated entirely underground or not at all. Supporters argued that repeal could help stimulate economic activity precisely when the country needed it most. The transition wasn't instant or uniform, since individual states retained significant control over how and whether alcohol sales would resume within their borders, leading to a patchwork of local laws. Still, for an economy desperate for any source of revenue and employment, the end of Prohibition offered a modest but welcome boost, illustrating how even social and moral debates of the era were increasingly filtered through the harsh practical lens of economic survival. And speaking of justice systems tested severely during this decade, one case in Alabama exposed deep and troubling flaws within the American legal process. Number 46, the Scottsboro Boys. In 1931, 9 black teenagers riding a freight train in Alabama were accused of assaulting 2 white women, launching a legal saga that would stretch across years and multiple trials. The initial trials moved with alarming speed, resulting in convictions and death sentences for most of the defendants, despite deeply questionable evidence and inadequate legal representation. The case drew national attention as details emerged about the rush proceedings, an all-white jury, and the broader racial dynamics of the Jim Crow-era South that shaped the entire process from arrest to verdict. Appeals eventually reached the Supreme Court, resulting in landmark rulings that addressed the right to adequate counsel and the exclusion of black citizens from jury service. Despite these legal victories, most of the defendants spent years in prison, and the case dragged on through repeated retrials well into the later 1930s and beyond. The Scottsboro case became a powerful symbol of racial injustice within the American legal system, highlighting how deeply prejudice could distort even the most basic guarantees of a fair trial. It remains one of the most studied and debated legal cases of the era, illustrating tensions that extended far beyond the economic struggles typically associated with the Depression itself. And speaking of struggles that combined economic desperation with dangerous confrontation, coal country became a battleground of its own during these years. Number 47, the Harlan County War. In the coal fields of Harlan County, Kentucky, tensions between mine owners and workers escalated into what became known as Bloody Harlan, a prolonged and often violent labor conflict during the early 1930s. Miners faced brutal working conditions, low wages, and company-controlled towns where nearly every aspect of daily life, from housing to the local store, remained under the mine owner's authority. When workers organized and pushed for better conditions, mine operators responded with evictions, hired guards, and sometimes outright violence against striking families. Gunfights broke out between miners and company enforcers, and the National Guard was eventually called in to try to restore order amid the chaos. The conflict captured national attention, drawing labor organizers, journalists, and even folk musicians who documented the miners' struggles through songs that outlasted the strikes themselves. Harlan County became a powerful symbol of the broader labor tensions simmering across industrial America during the Depression, illustrating how economic desperation could quickly turn into open confrontation when workers felt they had nothing left to lose. And speaking of coal country conflicts with deep roots, Harlan wasn't the first time Appalachian miners had taken up arms over their working conditions. Number 48, the Battle of Blair Mountain's legacy. Years before the Depression fully unfolded, the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 had already shown how far labor conflict in coal country could escalate, with thousands of armed miners clashing against company forces and even federal troops in one of the largest labor uprisings in American history. That earlier battle left lasting scars and deep distrust between miners and coal operators throughout the region. tensions that never fully faded during the following decade. As the Depression deepened economic hardship across Appalachia, memories of Blair Mountain continued shaping how both sides approached labor disputes, with miners wary of company promises and operators fearful of renewed organized resistance. Union organizing efforts throughout the 1930s often carried echoes of that earlier conflict, as workers invoked its memory while pushing for recognition and better conditions. Coal communities remained divided along old fault lines, with some families supporting unionization, while others depended on maintaining relationships with mine owners for their livelihoods. This lingering legacy meant that Appalachian labor struggles during the Depression were never simply about immediate economic conditions. They were also about decades of accumulated grievance, distrust, and occasional violence that made the region one of the most volatile labor landscapes in the entire country. Number 49. The 1934 West Coast waterfront strike. Along the docks of San Francisco and other Pacific ports, longshoremen had spent years enduring grueling, unpredictable work conditions under a hiring system many considered exploitative and humiliating. When workers organized and walked off the job in the spring of 1934, shipping companies refused to back down, and tensions steadily escalated as the strike dragged on for months. Matters reached a breaking point in July, when police attempted to move cargo through picket lines, resulting in violent clashes that left 2 strikers dead and dozens more injured in what became known as Bloody Thursday. The death sparked outrage across the labor movement and helped trigger a general strike that briefly shut down much of San Francisco, with thousands of workers from unrelated industries walking out in solidarity. National Guard troops were deployed to maintain order, underscoring just how seriously authorities viewed the unrest. In the aftermath, the strike ultimately led to greater recognition of dockworker unions and improved hiring practices along the coast. The event remains a defining moment in American labor history, illustrating how deeply frustrated workers had become and how far both sides were willing to go before any resolution could be reached. And speaking of labor conflicts that spilled into the streets that same turbulent year, the Midwest had its own violent confrontation brewing. Number 50. The Minneapolis Teamsters Strike. In 1934, truck drivers and warehouse workers in Minneapolis organized to demand recognition of their union and better working conditions, setting off a confrontation that would grip the city for months. Employers resisted fiercely, hiring private guards and coordinating closely with local police to break the strike, while workers organized flying picket squads to block deliveries across the city. Violence erupted repeatedly, including a clash known as Bloody Friday, when police opened fire on strikers, killing 2 men and wounding many others. The strike drew national attention as both sides refused to yield, and the Minnesota governor eventually declared martial law in an attempt to restore order. Despite the bloodshed, the strike ultimately succeeded, forcing employers to recognize the union and establishing Minneapolis as a stronghold for organized trucking labor. The episode became a significant chapter in the broader labor movement of the 1930s, demonstrating how determined organizing efforts, even when met with fierce resistance, could reshape entire industries. It also highlighted the deep divisions between workers seeking basic protections and employers determined to maintain control at almost any cost. And speaking of strikes that turned into full-scale confrontations with armed forces, Ohio saw its own dramatic standoff that same year. Number 51. The Toledo Auto Light Strike. In the spring of 1934, workers at the Electric Auto Light Company in Toledo, Ohio, walked off the job demanding union recognition and better wages, setting off a standoff that quickly grew far larger than anyone anticipated. As the company brought in strikebreakers to keep production running, tensions in the city escalated, and thousands of sympathetic workers and unemployed residents joined the picket lines in solidarity. Clashes between strikers and hired guards turned violent, prompting the Ohio governor to call in the National Guard to restore order in the streets surrounding the factory. Fighting continued for days, resulting in injuries on both sides and 2 deaths among the strikers. The scale of the confrontation shocked observers across the country, revealing just how volatile labor disputes had become during this period of economic desperation. Despite the violence, the strike ultimately ended with a settlement that granted workers union recognition, marking a significant victory for organized labor in the industrial Midwest. The Toledo strike became another example of how deeply entrenched conflicts between workers and employers could escalate into near battlefield conditions, foreshadowing similar confrontations that would continue to erupt throughout the decade. And speaking of confrontations that turned deadly with law enforcement directly involved, one strike in Chicago ended in tragedy that shocked the nation. Number 52, the Memorial Day Massacre. In May of 1937, striking steelworkers and their supporters gathered near a Republic steel plant in Chicago to demonstrate peacefully in support of union recognition, part of a broader wave of steel industry strikes sweeping the country. As the crowd approached police lines, officers opened fire without clear warning, killing 10 demonstrators and wounding dozens more, many of them shot in the back while attempting to flee. Newsreel footage of the event, later suppressed for a time, eventually revealed the extent of the violence and contradicted official police accounts that claimed the crowd had attacked first. The massacre drew widespread condemnation and became a rallying point for labor organizers pushing for stronger protections against violent strike-breaking tactics. Congressional investigations followed, examining the use of force against striking workers and raising uncomfortable questions about the relationship between police departments and industrial employers. The tragedy underscored just how dangerous labor organizing could remain, even years into the Depression and despite growing legal protections for unions. It stands as one of the starkest examples of how deadly the struggle for workplace rights could become in industrial America. And speaking of workers who chose a different tactic entirely, one strike in Michigan became famous not for street violence but for quiet, stubborn occupation. Number 53, the Flint sit-down strike. Beginning in late 1936 and stretching into early 1937, auto workers in Flint, Michigan, adopted a bold new strategy by occupying General Motors plants rather than simply walking out, effectively halting production while denying the company the ability to bring in replacement workers. Strikers endured brutal winter conditions inside the factories, sleeping on car seats, rationing food, and organizing shifts to maintain the occupation for weeks at a time. Company officials attempted to remove them through legal injunctions, police raids, and even by cutting off heat and food supplies. But the strikers held firm despite mounting pressure. Tensions boiled over during confrontations with police, though the strikers largely maintained discipline and avoided the kind of bloodshed seen in other labor conflicts of the era. The standoff finally ended when General Motors agreed to recognize the United Auto Workers Union, a landmark victory that reshaped labor relations across the entire automobile industry. The Flint strike demonstrated that determined, organized patience could succeed where confrontation alone often failed, becoming one of the most celebrated moments in American labor history. And speaking of workers whose everyday lives were tightly controlled by their employers, some communities left little room for workers to organize or resist at all. Number 54, company town dependence. Across parts of industrial and mining America, some employers didn't just provide jobs, they controlled nearly every aspect of daily life for their workers, from the houses they lived in to the stores where they bought groceries. In these company towns, wages were often paid partly in company scrip, currency that could only be spent at company-owned stores, effectively trapping workers in a cycle of dependence, with little real financial freedom. Local police forces and law enforcement in these towns were sometimes funded or influenced by the company itself, creating obvious conflicts of interest whenever labor disputes arose. Workers who spoke out or attempted to organize risked losing not just their jobs, but their homes and access to basic goods, since nearly everything in their lives ran through the same employer. This arrangement left many families with painfully few alternatives, since leaving often meant abandoning both employment and housing simultaneously. While not every company town operated this way, and conditions varied considerably by region and industry, the model illustrates how deeply intertwined economic survival and employer control could become during the Depression, leaving many workers with far less independence than the era's promises of opportunity suggested. Number 55. The National Industrial Recovery Act's failure. When Congress passed the NIRA in 1933, it was supposed to be one of the cornerstones of early recovery efforts, setting up codes of fair competition and giving workers the right to organize under Section 7A. Businesses displayed the Blue Eagle symbol to show compliance, and for a while it felt like the government had a coordinated plan to stabilize the economy. But the law gave the executive branch sweeping power to regulate industry, and in 1935, the Supreme Court unanimously struck it down in Schechter Poultry Corp. Versus United States, ruling that Congress had overstepped its constitutional authority. Just like that, one of the central pillars of early recovery policy was gone. Businesses that had reorganized around the new codes were left scrambling, and workers who'd gained bargaining protections suddenly found themselves in murky legal territory again. The ruling forced policymakers back to the drawing board, leading to new legislation that tried to preserve some of the NERA's goals in ways the courts would actually accept. It's a reminder that recovery wasn't a straight line forward. It was constant trial, error, and legal pushback, with entire programs rising and collapsing within just a couple of years. And speaking of major programs that met the same fate in the highest court in the land, the farm sector had its own legal reckoning just 1 year later. Number 56, the Agricultural Adjustment Act's first version. The original AAA, passed in 1933, tried to fix collapsing farm prices by paying farmers to reduce production, cutting back on crops and livestock to push prices back up through simple supply and demand. For farmers drowning in debt after years of overproduction and falling prices, the checks were a lifeline, and the program did help stabilize parts of the agricultural economy. But the law funded these payments through a tax on food processors, and in 1936, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Butler that this tax was unconstitutional, striking down the AAA's funding mechanism entirely. By then, the program had already reshaped how millions of acres were farmed and how the government related to agriculture altogether. Congress responded quickly, rewriting the law to tie payments to soil conservation instead of direct production limits, a workaround that survived legal scrutiny. The episode shows how experimental this entire era really was. Policies built quickly, tested in real time, and sometimes dismantled by the courts before anyone could fully measure whether they'd worked as intended. And speaking of farm policy producing scenes that struck many Americans as deeply unsettling, one particular strategy left a lasting, uncomfortable image in the public memory. Number 57, crop destruction amid hunger. As part of efforts to raise farm prices, federal programs paid farmers to plow under crops and reduce livestock herds, even as breadlines stretched around city blocks, and hunger remained a daily reality for millions. In 1933 alone, the government paid farmers to destroy around 10 million acres of cotton and slaughter roughly 6 million pigs, all in an effort to correct oversupply that had crushed prices for years. From a pure economic standpoint, the logic made sense. Reducing surplus was seen as necessary to stabilize a collapsed agricultural market. But to families standing in soup kitchen lines, watching food get destroyed rather than distributed felt like a bitter contradiction that was hard to reconcile. Critics at the time raised exactly this concern, and the government did work to redirect some resources toward relief efforts and food distribution programs. Still, the images of destroyed crops and culled livestock became a lasting symbol of the strange, sometimes painful logic required to fix a broken economic system, where solving one crisis sometimes meant creating scenes that looked like cruelty to people simply trying to survive. And speaking of recovery efforts that didn't go according to plan, just when things seemed to be improving, the entire economy took another unexpected hit. Number 58, the 1937 recession. By 1937, years into the Depression, the economy had finally shown real signs of improvement. Industrial production was climbing, and unemployment had dropped from its worst levels earlier in the decade. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the recovery stalled and reversed. Industrial production fell sharply, unemployment rose again, and the stock market dropped substantially within just a few months. Economists and historians have debated the causes for decades, pointing to a combination of factors including reduced government spending, tighter monetary policy, and new taxes that pulled money out of circulation at a sensitive moment. Whatever the exact cause, the downturn was a gut punch to a country that had started to believe the worst was finally behind them. It took renewed government spending and policy adjustments to help stabilize things again, though full recovery wouldn't really arrive until the economic demands of the Second World War kicked in. The 1937 recession serves as a sobering reminder that recovery from a crisis this large was never guaranteed to be smooth, steady, or permanent. And speaking of policy decisions that quietly shaped how much flexibility the government even had to fight the Depression, one traditional monetary rule made things harder than they needed to be. Number 59, the gold standard constraint. For much of the early Depression, the United States remained committed to the gold standard, a system requiring the dollar's value to be backed by and convertible into a fixed amount of gold. This commitment limited how much the government could expand the money supply or lower interest rates to stimulate the economy, since expanding currency too aggressively risked draining the nation's gold reserves. Many economists have since argued that strict adherence to the gold standard worsened the Depression by preventing more aggressive monetary intervention when it was desperately needed. As banks failed and deflation took hold, policymakers found their hands somewhat tied by this rigid framework. Countries that abandoned the gold standard earlier often recovered more quickly than those that clung to it. Eventually, the pressure became too much to ignore, and dramatic changes to the nation's monetary policy became necessary. And speaking of dramatic monetary changes, the government's next move directly affected the personal property of ordinary citizens across the country. Number 60. Gold Confiscation Order. In April 1933, President Roosevelt issued an executive order requiring most Americans to turn in their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency at a fixed rate. The goal was to give the government more flexibility to expand the money supply and combat deflation without the constraints of a rigid gold standard. Failure to comply could result in fines or even imprisonment, a stark demonstration of how seriously the government treated this policy shift. Shortly afterward, the price of gold was raised significantly, effectively devaluing the dollar and giving the government more room to maneuver economically. For many Americans, handing over gold felt like a deeply personal intrusion, even though exemptions existed for small amounts, jewelry, and collectible coins. The policy remains one of the more striking examples of how far the federal government was willing to go to address the economic emergency, reshaping the very meaning of the currency in people's pockets. Number 61. The dollar devaluation. After confiscating the nation's gold, the government took the next logical step in early 1934, raising the official price of gold from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. This single move effectively devalued the dollar by around 40% in terms of gold value, a staggering shift in how the nation's currency was defined. The idea was straightforward. A weaker dollar made American goods cheaper overseas, encouraged exports, and gave the government more breathing room to fight deflation. For ordinary Americans, the change was mostly invisible in daily life, but its ripple effects touched everything from international trade to bank balance sheets. Some economists point to this devaluation as one of the more effective tools used during the entire Depression, helping loosen the grip of tight money that had strangled the economy for years. Critics worried about long-term instability and the precedent of a government unilaterally redefining its own currency's worth. Either way, the devaluation marked a clear break from the rigid gold standard thinking that had dominated policy for decades, another sign that Washington was willing to rewrite the rules when the old ones simply weren't working anymore. And speaking of rules rewritten in response to economic crisis, trade policy had already taken its own controversial turn a few years earlier, with consequences that reached far beyond American borders. Number 62. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff. Passed in 1930, just months after the stock market crash, this law raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods, an attempt to protect struggling American industries and farmers from foreign competition. The intention was to shield domestic jobs during a moment of rising panic, but the results proved far messier than lawmakers anticipated. Trading partners around the world responded with tariffs of their own, retaliatory measures that made it harder for American exporters to sell goods abroad just when they needed international markets most. Global trade, already fragile, began contracting sharply as countries turned inward and protectionism spread like a chain reaction. More than 1,000 economists had actually signed a petition urging the president not to sign the bill, warning specifically about the risk of retaliation, but the legislation moved forward anyway. Whether Smoot-Hawley caused the Depression or simply made an already bad situation worse remains a genuinely debated question among historians. What's less debatable is the broader lesson that in an interconnected global economy, unilateral moves rarely stay unilateral for long, and everyone often ends up paying some part of the price together. And speaking of a world economy turning inward, the consequences of that shift showed up almost immediately in the numbers. Number 63. World trade collapse. As tariffs rose and nations retaliated against one another, global trade didn't just slow down, it collapsed. Between 1929 and 1934, the total value of world trade fell by roughly two-thirds, a staggering contraction that touched nearly every corner of the globe. Ports sat quieter. Cargo ships carried lighter loads, and entire industries built around exporting goods suddenly found their markets shrinking or disappearing altogether. American farmers who depended on selling surplus crops overseas were hit especially hard, watching foreign demand dry up just as domestic prices were already collapsing under their own weight. Dock workers, shipping companies, and manufacturing towns tied to international commerce felt this squeeze in very direct, very personal ways. Layoffs, shortened hours, and businesses closing their doors for good. This collapse in trade didn't happen in isolation. It fed back into the broader economic downturn, deepening unemployment and financial strain across countries that had once relied on healthy international exchange. The interconnected nature of the crisis became painfully clear. A downturn in one country's economy could ripple outward, shrinking opportunity for workers and families thousands of miles away who had nothing to do with the original crash. And speaking of ripple effects that historians still argue about today, the exact role tariffs played in deepening the Depression remains a genuinely contested question. Number 64. The Hawley-Smoot blame debate. For decades, economists and historians have debated just how much responsibility the Smoot-Hawley tariff bears for the severity of the Great Depression. Most agree that the tariff, combined with the retaliatory measures it triggered, worsened global trade conditions at an already fragile moment, making recovery harder for countries that depended on international commerce. Where the disagreement lies is in scale. Some argue tariffs were a major contributing factor, while others see them as one relatively modest piece of a much larger puzzle that included banking failures, monetary policy, and structural weaknesses that existed long before the bill passed. Part of the challenge is that isolating any single policy's exact impact within such a complex global collapse is nearly impossible using the historical data available. What most historians do agree on is the broader lesson. Protectionist policies enacted without considering international consequences can create feedback loops that are difficult to predict and even harder to reverse. The debate itself has become a kind of case study for future policymakers, a reminder that trade decisions rarely stay contained within a single nation's borders, no matter how good the original intentions might have been. And speaking of policies aimed at fixing problems within America's own financial system, Washington eventually turned its attention to Wall Street itself. Number 65. The Pecora Investigation. Between 1932 and 1934, a Senate committee investigation led by Chief Counsel Ferdinand Pecora dug deep into the practices that had fueled the stock market's reckless boom and devastating crash. Witness after witness, including some of the most powerful bankers in the country, were called to testify publicly about questionable practices that had gone largely unchecked throughout the 1920s. The hearings revealed conflicts of interest, misleading stock offerings, and executives who paid little or no income tax while ordinary Americans struggled to survive. Newspapers covered the testimony closely, and public outrage grew as details emerged about just how disconnected Wall Street's practices had been from basic accountability or transparency. The investigation didn't just expose wrongdoing, it built the political momentum needed to justify serious financial reform, something that had seemed nearly impossible just a few years earlier. Pecora's work became a turning point, transforming public anger into concrete legislative action rather than letting outrage simply fade away once the headlines moved on to something else. And speaking of legislative action born directly from those hearings, one new federal agency emerged specifically to prevent a repeat of the abuses that had just been exposed. Number 66. The Securities and Exchange Commission. Created in 1934 as a direct response to the excesses uncovered by the Pecora investigation, the SEC was designed to regulate the stock market and restore public confidence in a financial system that had utterly betrayed that trust. For the first time, companies issuing stock were required to disclose meaningful financial information to investors, and practices like market manipulation faced real legal consequences, rather than simply being an accepted cost of doing business. The agency was given authority to oversee exchanges, investigate fraud, and enforce rules that previously hadn't existed in any coordinated federal form. Supporters saw it as a necessary safeguard, a way to ensure the kind of reckless speculation that preceded the crash couldn't so easily happen again unnoticed. Critics worried about government overreach into private markets, a tension that has echoed through debates about financial regulation ever since. Whatever side of that debate one falls on, the SEC's creation marked a lasting shift, a recognition that unregulated markets carried risks not just for investors, but for the entire national economy resting on their stability. Number 67, the FDIC. After watching thousands of banks collapse and take their customers' life savings down with them, Washington finally addressed the panic at its source, the simple fear that your money might vanish overnight. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, created in 1934, guaranteed that if a bank failed, depositors would still get their money back up to a certain limit. This might sound like a small technical fix, but its psychological effect was enormous. Bank runs had been driven largely by fear. The rational fear that if your neighbors withdrew their savings first, there might be nothing left for you. With federal insurance in place, that fear started to lose its grip. People stopped hiding cash under mattresses and started trusting the banking system again. The number of bank failures dropped dramatically in the years following the FDIC's creation, a stark contrast to the thousands that had failed in the early years of the Depression. It wasn't a flashy program, no parades, no headlines about heroic public works, just a quiet guarantee that reshaped how Americans related to their own money. Sometimes the most effective fixes aren't dramatic at all. They're just steady reassurance that the rules have finally changed for the better. And speaking of programs designed to put people back to work rather than simply reassure them, one of the most visible efforts sent young men into the nation's forests and fields. Number 68, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Launched in 1933, the CCC took unemployed young men, many of them barely out of their teens, and put them to work planting trees, building trails, and fighting soil erosion across the country. The work was physical and often exhausting, but it came with steady meals, housing, and a small wage, a portion of which was required to be sent home to struggling families. For many participants, it was their first steady paycheck in years, and for their families back home, it was often the difference between scraping by and going under entirely. The CCC planted an estimated 3 billion trees over its lifetime, helped combat the erosion that had worsened the Dust Bowl, and developed infrastructure still used in state and national parks today. Beyond the environmental impact, there was something else happening. Young men who might otherwise have drifted into despair or crime were given structure, purpose, and a sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. It wasn't a perfect program, but for millions of families, those small monthly checks mailed home from a forest camp meant survival during years when survival was never guaranteed. And speaking of programs that weren't perfect despite their good intentions, the CCC carried a flaw common to much of the era's federal relief efforts. Number 69, CCC segregation. While the Civilian Conservation Corps offered genuine opportunity to millions of young men, it largely operated within the racial norms of its time, meaning camps were typically segregated, with black enrollees often assigned to separate units, sometimes with fewer resources and less favorable treatment than their white counterparts. In some regions, local resistance to integrated camps led to policies that further limited opportunities for black participants, despite federal guidelines that technically prohibited discrimination in enrollment. The disparity wasn't always identical from state to state. Some administrators pushed for fairer treatment, while others enforced stricter separation, reflecting the patchwork nature of racial policy across Depression-era America. Native American participants were sometimes organized into their own divisions, working on reservation lands under a related program with its own separate structure. The CCC undeniably provided real economic relief to black families who benefited from its wages, but the segregated camps served as a quiet reminder that federal relief programs, however well-intentioned, still operated within the deeply unequal social framework of the time. It's a pattern worth remembering. Help and inequality could exist within the very same program simultaneously. And speaking of ambitious programs that tried to employ Americans on a massive scale, one agency went even further than planting trees. Number 70, the Works Progress Administration. Established in 1935, the WPA became one of the largest and most far-reaching relief programs of the entire New Deal, ultimately employing over 8 million Americans before it ended in 1943. Workers built roads, bridges, schools, airports, and public buildings across the country, many of which are still standing and in use today. But the WPA wasn't limited to construction. It also funded writers, musicians, actors, and visual artists through dedicated arts projects, an unusual and somewhat controversial decision to treat creative work as legitimate employment worthy of federal support. Murals appeared in post offices, plays were staged in small towns that had never seen professional theater, and thousands of oral histories and cultural documents were recorded for the first time. Critics at the time called some of this wasteful government spending, questioning why taxpayers should fund painters and playwrights during an economic crisis. Supporters countered that putting people to work, regardless of their profession, kept families fed and communities functioning. The debate over the proper role of government-funded work has never fully disappeared, but the WPA's physical and cultural legacy remains scattered across the country to this day. And speaking of controversies surrounding those creative projects, some of the art produced didn't sit well with the very government funding it. Number 71, WPA Arts Censorship. Because the WPA's arts programs employed painters, sculptors, and playwrights directly through federal funding, the government occasionally found itself uncomfortably close to work it considered politically sensitive or embarrassing. Murals depicting labor struggles, racial injustice, or critiques of capitalism sometimes drew complaints from local officials or members of Congress, uneasy about taxpayer money supporting anything resembling political dissent. Some pieces were altered, removed, or quietly shelved before they ever reached public view, while others survived only after heated local debates about what qualified as legitimate art versus propaganda. The Federal Theater Project, one of the WPA's most ambitious arts branches, faced particularly intense scrutiny, eventually becoming a target for congressional investigation over concerns about political content in its productions. This tension revealed an underlying paradox. The government wanted to employ artists, but struggled with the reality that genuine artistic expression sometimes challenges the very authorities funding it. The episode remains a useful case study in the friction between public funding and creative freedom, a debate that continues in various forms whenever government money supports the arts. And speaking of WPA projects that produced lasting, if imperfect, historical records, one initiative captured voices that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Number 72, the Federal Writers Project interviews. As part of the broader WPA arts initiatives, the Federal Writers Project sent interviewers across the South in the late 1930s to record first-hand accounts from formerly enslaved people, many of whom were then in their 80s or 90s. These interviews, eventually compiled into thousands of pages of narratives, offered rare direct testimony about slavery from those who had actually lived it, a resource historians still rely on today. The project wasn't without significant flaws. Some interviewers were white, which likely influenced how openly elderly black subjects felt they could speak about their experiences under a system built on racial control. Transcription styles at the time sometimes rendered speech in exaggerated dialect, a practice modern historians view with real discomfort and caution when using these sources. Despite these limitations, the interviews remain one of the only large-scale collections of first-hand accounts of slavery gathered directly from survivors, a historical resource that simply could not be recreated once that generation passed away. Imperfect as it was, the project preserved voices that otherwise would have vanished entirely from the historical record. Number 73, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Created in 1933, the TVA set out to transform one of the poorest regions in the country by building a system of dams along the Tennessee River, bringing electricity to areas that had never had it, and controlling floods that had devastated farms and towns for generations. The results were genuinely transformative. Rural electrification changed daily life for millions, farming became more productive, and industry followed the power lines into places that had previously been left behind economically. But that transformation came at a real cost for the communities sitting where those dams needed to go. Whole towns were relocated, farms that had been in families for generations were flooded, and cemeteries containing generations of ancestors sometimes had to be moved or were lost entirely beneath the rising water. The TVA offered compensation to displaced families, though many felt it fell short of what their land and history were actually worth. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in large infrastructure projects. Undeniable benefit to the region as a whole, paired with real and lasting loss for the specific people standing in the way of progress. And speaking of the price paid by displaced families, the TVA wasn't the only New Deal project asking communities to sacrifice their homes for the greater good. Number 74, dam displacement. Beyond the Tennessee Valley, other large New Deal dam projects across the country followed a similar pattern, promising flood control, electricity, and irrigation, while quietly forcing families off land some had worked for generations. Entire communities were told to pack up and leave before the water rose, sometimes with only months to relocate farms, homes, and even family burial grounds to higher ground. Compensation varied widely depending on the project and the region, and many families felt the payments never truly reflected what they were losing, not just property, but a sense of place and continuity. Native American communities were sometimes disproportionately affected, as reservation lands were considered easier to acquire or reroute around existing settlements. The federal government generally framed these projects as necessary sacrifices for regional progress, and in fairness, the resulting electricity and flood control did benefit millions of people downstream. But for the families standing in the path of a rising reservoir, progress looked a lot more like eviction. These stories rarely made national headlines at the time, overshadowed by the impressive scale of the dams themselves. But they remain an important reminder that even celebrated New Deal achievements carried real human costs. And speaking of New Deal programs with real limitations built into their design, one of the era's most enduring achievements started out far narrower than most people realize. Number 75. Social Security's limited beginning. When President Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in 1935, it was hailed as a landmark achievement, and in many ways it was, establishing a system of old age insurance that still supports millions of Americans today. But the original law left significant gaps. Agricultural workers and domestic employees, occupations that employed a large share of Black Americans and other minority workers at the time, were excluded from coverage entirely. This wasn't necessarily framed as intentional discrimination in the legislative record, but the practical effect was that many of the workers most in need of a safety net were left without one for years. Congress gradually expanded coverage in the decades that followed, eventually including nearly all workers by the 1950s and beyond. Supporters of the original law point out that passing any national retirement program in 1935 was a significant political achievement, and that expansion was always the plan for a system built incrementally. Critics note that the initial exclusions weren't random, and that the resulting gaps in coverage tracked closely with existing racial and economic inequalities of the era. Social Security's legacy today is one of broad success, but its founding compromises are worth remembering too. And speaking of federal programs that started with good intentions but uneven execution, family assistance during the Depression followed a similarly complicated path. Number 76, the Aid to Dependent Children Program. Established alongside Social Security in 1935, this program aimed to provide financial support to single mothers struggling to raise children without a breadwinner in the household, a genuine need during an era when widowed and abandoned mothers had few other options. But because the program was administered largely at the state and local level, eligibility and benefit amounts varied enormously depending on where a family happened to live. Local administrators often had wide discretion in deciding who counted as a suitable recipient, and that discretion sometimes reflected existing local prejudices, with Black families and other minority applicants frequently receiving smaller benefits or facing additional scrutiny compared to white applicants in similar circumstances. Some states set requirements around a mother's morality or home conditions that were applied unevenly and subjectively. The program did provide meaningful help to countless families who might otherwise have faced deep poverty, and it laid the groundwork for later federal family assistance programs. But its uneven administration is a reminder that federal funding didn't always guarantee federal fairness, especially when local officials retained significant control over who actually received help. And speaking of federal policy that tried to correct past wrongs with mixed results, one law attempted to reverse decades of assimilation policy toward Native American tribes. Number 77, the Indian Reorganization Act. Passed in 1934, this law marked a genuine shift in federal policy, moving away from decades of forced assimilation efforts that had broken up tribal lands and suppressed native governance structures. The act encouraged tribes to establish their own constitutions and governments, ended the allotment system that had stripped millions of acres from tribal control, and restored some measure of self-governance. For many tribes, this represented meaningful progress after generations of policies designed to dissolve tribal identity entirely. But implementation varied significantly. Some tribes embraced the new framework, while others felt the government-modeled constitutions didn't reflect their traditional governance systems at all, essentially replacing one imposed structure with another. Not all tribes even had the opportunity to vote on adopting the act, and some rejected it outright. Historians today view the law as a well-intentioned but imperfect attempt at reform, genuine progress compared to what came before, but still shaped significantly by outside assumptions about what Native self-governance should look like. And speaking of federal policy affecting Native communities during this period, one program remains a particularly painful memory for many families even today. Number 78, the Livestock Reduction Program. During the 1930s, federal officials implemented a program on Navajo lands aimed at reducing livestock herds, arguing that overgrazing was causing severe soil erosion that threatened the long-term viability of the land itself. Government agents purchased and in many cases killed sheep, goats, and horses that families depended on for both their livelihoods and their cultural identity. For Navajo families, livestock represented far more than economic value. It was tied to tradition, spirituality, and generational wealth passed down through families. The forced reduction devastated many households financially and left lasting emotional scars that are still discussed within Navajo communities today. Federal officials at the time framed the program as necessary conservation, pointing to genuine environmental concerns about overgrazing during a period of severe drought. But the way it was carried out, often without adequate consultation or compensation, left many families feeling that their livelihoods were sacrificed for a policy decision made far away in Washington. It remains one of the most painful chapters of federal Indian policy during the Depression era. Number 79, Filipino repatriation pressure. Filipino Americans occupied a strange legal category during the Depression. As nationals of an American territory, they could migrate to the mainland without the restrictions placed on other Asian immigrants, and many did, working grueling jobs in agriculture and canneries up and down the West Coast for wages far below what other workers received. But when the Depression hit and jobs grew scarce, that same population became a convenient target for resentment. Congress passed the Filipino Repatriation Act in 1935, offering free one-way passage back to the Philippines for anyone willing to leave and give up their right to return. The offer looked generous on paper, but for many it amounted to pressure dressed up as choice, an implicit message that they were no longer welcome in a country they'd worked hard to build a life in. Only a few thousand actually accepted the offer, far fewer than officials had hoped, since most had already put down roots or simply couldn't imagine starting over again in a place they'd left years earlier. Those who stayed continued facing discrimination in housing, employment, and even the right to marry outside their community in several states. It's a quieter story than some Depression-era policies, but it reveals how economic hardship could sharpen existing prejudices into official government action. And speaking of communities squeezed by both economic hardship and discriminatory laws, Japanese American farmers faced a particularly difficult combination of the two. Number 80. Japanese American farm losses. Long before wartime internment forced Japanese Americans from their homes entirely, many were already struggling under a patchwork of state alien land laws that restricted or outright banned land ownership by immigrants ineligible for citizenship, a category that specifically targeted Japanese immigrants. These laws, present in California and several other Western states, meant that even successful Japanese American farmers often worked land they could never fully own, leasing through relatives who were citizens or navigating legal workarounds that left their livelihoods perpetually vulnerable. When the Depression arrived, falling crop prices and tightening credit hit these already precarious operations especially hard, and banks were frequently less willing to extend loans to farmers who couldn't legally hold title to their own land as collateral. Some families lost farms they'd spent decades improving, watching land they'd cleared and cultivated slip away through foreclosure or forced sale. The economic hardship of the era compounded discrimination that already existed, leaving Japanese American agricultural communities disproportionately exposed to the decade's financial shocks. It's a reminder that the Depression didn't create these inequalities from nothing. It simply applied pressure to fault lines that had already been carved into the legal system years before. And speaking of the physical land itself struggling under pressure, the federal government eventually tried a massive, ambitious fix to a problem it had watched unfold for years. Number 81, the Great Plains Shelter Belt. After watching topsoil from the southern plains blow away in the storms that defined the Dust Bowl, the federal government launched an enormous reforestation effort in 1934, planting rows of trees stretching from Texas up through the Dakotas. The idea was straightforward. Windbreaks made of trees could slow the wind at ground level, reducing the erosion that had turned once productive farmland into drifting dust. Over the following years, workers planted roughly 200 million trees across a strip of land hundreds of miles long, one of the largest environmental engineering projects the country had ever attempted. The shelter belt did provide real benefits, reducing wind speed near the ground, and giving some farms a measure of protection that helped stabilize soil in the years that followed. But it was never a complete solution. Full recovery of the region's soil health took decades, and some of the underlying farming practices that had contributed to the crisis persisted well after the trees went into the ground. Critics at the time and since have debated how much credit the shelter belt truly deserves, compared to simple changes in rainfall patterns and farming techniques. Either way, it remains one of the more visible physical legacies of the Depression, rows of trees still standing across the plains today. And speaking of ambitious government projects meant to address rural poverty directly, one agency tried a very different approach, moving people rather than planting trees. Number 82. The Resettlement Administration. Established in 1935, this agency set out to address rural poverty by relocating struggling farm families from land that was considered too poor or too damaged to support them, moving them instead into newly planned communities with better soil, cooperative farming arrangements, and modern housing. The idea reflected a broader New Deal belief that careful planning could solve problems that individual effort alone couldn't overcome. Some of these communities did provide real, tangible improvement for the families who moved into them, offering stability and infrastructure that simply hadn't existed before. But the program's reach was always limited compared to the scale of rural poverty across the country. Funding constraints and political opposition meant only a small fraction of families who needed help ever received it, and the agency was frequently criticized as an example of government overreach into decisions people felt should remain private. The Resettlement Administration was eventually folded into the Farm Security Administration in 1937. Its ambitions scaled back considerably from its original vision. It stands today as an example of the New Deal's willingness to experiment boldly, paired with the practical limits of turning that boldness into a program benefiting more than a small percentage of the population that needed it. And speaking of agencies trying to document and address rural poverty, one photograph from that era became more famous than almost any other image of the Depression itself. Number 83, Migrant Mother. In 1936, photographer Dorothea Lange captured an image of Florence Owens Thompson sitting with her children at a California pea pickers camp. Her expression weary and distant, her children turned toward her as if seeking reassurance she couldn't quite offer. The photograph, taken for the Farm Security Administration, quickly became one of the defining images of the entire Depression era, reproduced endlessly and held up as a symbol of resilience amid hardship. But the actual story behind the photograph was more complicated than the image alone suggested. Thompson later expressed mixed feelings about the photo, noting she never received compensation for its widespread use, and felt the image reduced her family's specific struggles into a generic symbol for public consumption. She and her family also managed to survive the Depression through their own resourcefulness, a detail often left out of the photograph's popular legacy. The image remains a powerful piece of American visual history, but it's worth remembering that behind every iconic photograph is a real person whose full story rarely fits neatly into a single frame. And speaking of powerful images shaping public perception of the Depression, Lange's photograph was just one piece of a much larger government effort to document suffering across the country. Number 84, the Farm Security Administration photographs. Between 1935 and 1944, the FSA employed a team of talented photographers, including Lange Walker Evans and Gordon Parks, to travel the country documenting rural poverty in vivid, unforgettable detail. The resulting archive, containing over 170,000 images, remains one of the most comprehensive visual records of the Depression era ever created. These photographs served a genuine documentary purpose, But they were also explicitly intended to build public and congressional support for New Deal relief programs, meaning photographers sometimes selected or framed images specifically to generate sympathy for federal intervention. Some subjects were even asked to pose in particular ways to strengthen the emotional impact of a shot. This doesn't make the images dishonest exactly. The poverty they depicted was undeniably real. But it does mean the collection wasn't a neutral historical record so much as a carefully curated argument for a political agenda. Understanding that context doesn't diminish the photograph's power. It simply adds an important layer of nuance to images that shaped, and continue to shape, how generations of Americans have pictured the Depression in their minds. Number 85. Radio escapism. For families scraping by without stable food or housing, the radio became something close to a lifeline, not for information exactly, but for the simple relief of forgetting their troubles for 30 minutes at a time. Comedy programs, variety shows, and serialized dramas filled evenings across the country, offering laughter and music to households that owned little else of value. Radio ownership actually increased during parts of the Depression, even as other spending collapsed, because families considered it less a luxury and more a necessity for maintaining some sense of normalcy. Programs like Amos and Andy or the Jack Benny program drew enormous audiences, uniting rich and poor alike around the same broadcasts at the same hour, for a family unsure where next week's rent was coming from. Tuning in to a familiar voice cracking jokes or a big band playing through crackling static offered a kind of psychological survival tool, not solving anything materially but making the unbearable slightly more bearable. Historians studying the era's mental health often point to radio as an underappreciated stabilizing force, a small mercy woven into an otherwise brutal decade. It reminds us that survival during hardship isn't only about food and shelter. Sometimes it's about finding a few minutes of relief from thinking about the hardship at all. And speaking of small mercies that help people cope, another form of entertainment offered an even more immersive escape for just a few cents. Number 86. Movie palace bargains. Despite the widespread poverty of the decade, movie attendance remained remarkably strong, and theater owners intentionally kept ticket prices low, sometimes just a dime to keep audiences coming through the doors. Grand movie palaces, ornate and dazzling compared to the drabness of everyday life outside, offered a few hours of complete escape into glamorous musicals, gripping dramas, and light-hearted comedies. Double features became common, giving audiences even more entertainment for their limited money, and many theaters added giveaways like free dishware or raffle nights to draw in struggling families looking for any small incentive. Going to the movies wasn't frivolous indulgence so much as an affordable form of psychological relief, a temporary escape from breadlines and eviction notices into worlds where problems resolved themselves within 90 minutes. Studios responded by producing films specifically designed to lift spirits, leaning into fantasy, comedy, and lavish spectacle rather than reflecting the bleakness audiences already lived with daily. The popularity of cinema during this era helped cement Hollywood's golden age, proving that even in economic collapse, people were willing to find a few spare coins for shared collective escapism. It's a small but telling detail about how communities coped when reality offered little comfort on its own. And speaking of people searching for any form of relief, some had to search much further than their local movie theater, often riding the rails in search of work itself. Number 87. The rise of hobo jungles. As unemployment spread and families lost their homes, thousands of men and some women and children took to traveling the country in search of work, forming informal camps near rail yards that became known as hobo jungles. These camps offered a temporary sense of community among strangers facing identical circumstances, with informal codes of conduct governing how newcomers should behave and how resources like food or firewood should be shared. Life in these camps was unpredictable and often dangerous, exposed to harsh weather, disease, and the constant threat of violence from other travelers or hostile locals. Local authorities frequently viewed these camps with suspicion, sometimes dismantling them entirely or arresting residents under vagrancy statutes that criminalized simply being homeless and unemployed. Despite the hardship, these camps became an important part of Depression-era folklore, later inspiring the itinerant characters that populated novels and films depicting the era's wandering laborers. They represented both resourcefulness and desperation simultaneously, communities built from necessity in the margins of a country that had little formal support to offer displaced workers. The hobo jungle became a defining symbol of a decade where staying in one place often meant staying unemployed indefinitely. And speaking of desperate travel in search of opportunity, getting between these camps and potential jobs required a dangerous method of transportation entirely its own. Number 88. Freight train riders. With little money for proper travel, thousands of unemployed Americans illegally hopped onto freight trains, riding in boxcars or clinging to the outsides of moving rail cars in hopes of reaching cities or farms where work might be available. This method of travel was extraordinarily dangerous. Riders faced the constant risk of falling beneath the wheels, freezing temperatures during long overnight journeys, and violent encounters with other desperate travelers competing for limited space. Railroad companies employed armed security, sometimes called railroad bulls, whose job was to catch and forcibly remove trespassers, occasionally with brutal methods that left riders injured or worse. Despite these dangers, riding the rails became such a widespread practice that entire subcultures developed around it, complete with informal networks passing along information about which routes were safest or which towns offered temporary work. Teenagers and young adults made up a significant portion of these riders, some running away from families who could no longer support them, others simply seeking independence during an era offering few other options. Death and injury statistics from this practice remain difficult to calculate precisely, but historians agree the toll was substantial. It stands as one of the more visibly desperate images of the Depression, entire generations quite literally chasing survival down railroad tracks. And speaking of the legal consequences faced by those simply trying to survive, local governments often responded to homelessness with punishment rather than assistance. Number 89. Vagrancy laws. Across much of the country, local police departments relied heavily on vagrancy statutes to arrest and remove homeless or itinerant individuals from public spaces, effectively criminalizing poverty itself rather than addressing its underlying causes. These laws, often vaguely written, gave officers broad discretion to detain anyone deemed to be wandering without visible means of support, regardless of whether they were actively seeking work. Enforcement varied significantly by region, with some cities using these laws primarily to keep transient populations moving through rather than settling within town limits, effectively pushing the problem onto neighboring communities instead of solving it. Arrests under these statutes sometimes resulted in short jail sentences or forced labor programs, adding further hardship to individuals already struggling with unemployment and displacement. Civil liberties concerns around these laws existed even at the time, though enforcement continued largely unchecked throughout the decade. Some communities did establish shelters or relief programs as more compassionate alternatives, but punitive responses remained common nationwide. The prevalence of vagrancy arrests during the Depression offers a sobering reminder of how economic desperation was sometimes treated as a legal problem rather than a humanitarian one, an approach that complicated recovery efforts for many of the era's most vulnerable citizens. And speaking of confrontations between desperate workers and authorities, few incidents captured that tension as starkly as one march outside a major automobile plant. Number 90, the 1932 Ford Hunger March. In March of 1932, thousands of unemployed workers organized a march toward Ford's massive River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, intending to present a list of demands including jobs, healthcare, and an end to discriminatory hiring practices. As marchers approached the plant, they were met by a combined force of Dearborn police and private Ford security personnel, and tensions escalated quickly. Police used tear gas to disperse the crowd, and when marchers responded by throwing rocks, security forces opened fire directly into the crowd of demonstrators. 4 marchers were killed that day, with a 5th dying later from injuries sustained during the confrontation, and dozens more were wounded. The event shocked the nation, drawing widespread condemnation of both the excessive use of force and the underlying conditions that had driven workers to march in the first place. It became a rallying point for labor organizing throughout the auto industry, contributing to the broader unionization efforts that would eventually transform Detroit's manufacturing sector in the years following the Depression. The Ford Hunger March remains a stark reminder of how economic desperation could erupt into violence when peaceful demands for basic dignity went unanswered by those holding power. Number 91. The 1931 Long Island Potato Strike. Farm workers on Long Island, some of the lowest paid laborers in the entire agricultural economy, organized a strike demanding better wages for the brutal work of harvesting potatoes under the summer sun. Growers responded harshly, bringing in strikebreakers and calling on local police to arrest organizers on charges that often amounted to little more than standing together in protest. Violence broke out on picket lines as tensions between desperate workers and equally desperate farm owners, themselves squeezed by falling crop prices, boiled over into physical confrontations. The strike ultimately achieved limited concessions, but it highlighted just how little protection agricultural workers had compared to industrial laborers elsewhere. Farm labor remained largely excluded from the labor protections eventually granted through New Deal legislation, leaving these workers vulnerable for years afterward. The Long Island strike stands as a small but telling example of how the Depression's hardships extended deep into rural America, far from the breadlines and factory closures most commonly associated with the era. And speaking of agricultural workers pushed to the breaking point, a much larger and more violent confrontation was unfolding on the opposite side of the country. Number 92, the Imperial Valley lettuce strike. In 1933, thousands of farm workers in California's Imperial Valley walked off the fields, demanding higher wages for the exhausting labor of harvesting lettuce in punishing desert heat. Local authorities, closely aligned with the powerful growers' associations, responded with mass arrests, raids on strikers' camps, and open hostility toward union organizers. Vigilante groups formed to intimidate strikers, sometimes with the tacit approval of local law enforcement, blurring the line between official policing and outright suppression. Many of the strikers were Mexican and Filipino immigrants, facing not only economic exploitation, but also the added burden of racial discrimination that made organizing even more dangerous. The strike eventually collapsed under the weight of arrests and intimidation, achieving few lasting gains for the workers involved. It nonetheless became an important chapter in the long history of California farm labor organizing, foreshadowing later movements that would fight the same battles decades afterward. The Imperial Valley strike revealed just how far growers and local governments were willing to go to protect agricultural profits during economic collapse. And speaking of desperation manifesting in dramatic and dangerous ways, some of that same desperation showed up behind prison walls as well. Number 93. The 1934 Alcatraz escape attempt. The federal government had just converted Alcatraz Island into a maximum security prison, intended to house the most dangerous and escape-prone criminals produced by an era rife with organized crime and bank robbery. Almost immediately, inmates began testing the limits of the supposedly escape-proof facility, driven by the same restless desperation that characterized so much of the decade outside its walls. Early attempts were crude and quickly thwarted, but they set the tone for Alcatraz's reputation as a place where danger and desperation collided daily. The prison itself became a kind of dark symbol of the era, a fortress built to contain the violent byproducts of economic collapse and lawlessness. Public fascination with Alcatraz grew alongside fascination with the criminals it held, feeding a media appetite for crime stories that offered dramatic distraction from everyday hardship. The island's grim reputation only deepened as the decade wore on, cementing its place in American cultural memory. And speaking of stories that captured the nation's attention amid economic despair, one crime in particular dominated headlines like almost nothing else. Number 94. The Lindbergh kidnapping. In 1932, the infant son of famed aviator Charles Lindbergh was kidnapped from the family's New Jersey home, sparking what newspapers quickly dubbed the crime of the century. The nation, already reeling from economic collapse, became utterly consumed by the case, following every development with an intensity that reflected both genuine horror and a desperate need for distraction. The child was tragically found dead weeks later, and the ensuing investigation and trial captivated Americans for years afterward. The case led directly to new federal kidnapping legislation, informally known as the Lindbergh Law, expanding federal jurisdiction over such crimes. For a country struggling with unemployment and uncertainty, the case offered a strange kind of unity, a shared tragedy that briefly overshadowed shared economic suffering. It remains one of the most studied criminal cases in American history, a haunting reminder of how personal tragedy and national anxiety intertwined during the decade's darkest years. And speaking of crime, capturing the public imagination, a very different kind of criminal was earning folk hero status across the country. Number 95. The rise of bank robbers. Figures like John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, and Pretty Boy Floyd became household names as they robbed banks across the Midwest, often outmaneuvering law enforcement in dramatic and highly publicized fashion. To many struggling Americans, these outlaws represented a strange kind of rebellion against banks widely blamed for the economic collapse and subsequent foreclosures. Newspapers eagerly covered their exploits, sometimes romanticizing their crimes as acts of defiance against institutions that had already taken so much from ordinary families. Law enforcement agencies, including the newly empowered FBI, launched aggressive manhunts, eventually killing or capturing most of these figures within a few violent years. The public fascination with these outlaws reflected deeper anxieties about justice, inequality, and who exactly deserved sympathy during hard times. Their brief, violent careers became permanently woven into Depression-era folklore, symbols of both lawlessness and quiet public resentment toward financial institutions. And speaking of institutions facing public resentment and legal challenges, the federal government itself soon found its recovery efforts under direct constitutional threat. Number 96, the 1935 Supreme Court crisis. As the Depression dragged on, the Supreme Court began striking down key pieces of New Deal legislation, ruling that programs like the National Industrial Recovery Act exceeded constitutional limits on federal authority. These rulings created significant uncertainty about how far the federal government could actually go in attempting to stabilize the economy through direct intervention. Supporters of the New Deal viewed the decisions as obstructionist, while critics saw them as necessary checks against unprecedented expansions of federal power. The conflict eventually led to a proposed judicial reorganization plan, controversial even among allies, aimed at adding more sympathetic justices to the court. The proposal ultimately failed, but the confrontation revealed just how contested the very legitimacy of New Deal recovery efforts remained years into the crisis. It stands as a reminder that even amid widespread suffering, fundamental disagreements about government power and constitutional limits continued shaping the nation's uncertain path forward. Number 97, the court packing plan. In 1937, fresh off a landslide re-election, Roosevelt proposed adding up to 6 new justices to the Supreme Court, ostensibly to help an overworked bench keep pace with its caseload. Almost no one believed that explanation. The real goal was clear to everyone in Washington. Roosevelt wanted justices who wouldn't strike down his New Deal programs the way the existing court had done repeatedly. The backlash was immediate and fierce, even from members of his own party who saw the plan as a dangerous attempt to undermine judicial independence. Congress ultimately rejected the proposal outright. Interestingly, the court itself soon began upholding New Deal legislation anyway, leading some to joke about a switch in time that saved 9. Whether that shift happened because of the political pressure or simply reflected changing legal interpretations remains debated among historians. Either way, the episode remains one of the starkest examples of a president testing the boundaries between the branches of government during a moment of extraordinary crisis. And speaking of extraordinary measures that finally seemed to work, one massive event did more to end the Depression than any single New Deal program. Number 98, World War II and recovery. Once the United States entered the war in 1941, unemployment essentially vanished almost overnight. Factories that once sat idle now ran around the clock producing tanks, ships, and airplanes. Millions of men joined the military, while millions of women entered factories, filling roles once considered exclusively male. Government spending reached levels the New Deal never approached, pouring resources directly into industrial production. Whether the war alone ended the Depression or simply accelerated a recovery already underway remains a genuine point of debate among economists and historians. Some argue New Deal programs had already stabilized the economy, laying groundwork the war then built upon. Others credit wartime mobilization almost entirely. What's certain is that the scale of wartime spending dwarfed anything attempted during the previous decade, finally absorbing the unemployment that had haunted the country for 10 long years. And speaking of lasting effects that outlived the decade itself, the Depression left marks on people that no policy could ever fully erase. Number 99, the Depression's long shadow. Millions who lived through those 10 years carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Many developed lifelong habits of frugality, saving string, reusing containers, and refusing to waste even the smallest scraps of food. Debt became something to fear and avoid at almost any cost. A lesson learned from watching neighbors lose everything to foreclosure. Even decades later, Some elderly Americans kept cash hidden at home rather than trust banks completely. Psychologists have studied how economic trauma shapes behavior across generations, and the Depression remains one of the clearest examples in American history. It reshaped not just policy and politics, but the quiet, everyday habits of an entire generation, a shadow stretching far beyond the decade that created it.